Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to be talking about the mystery of death. So we're going to talk about kama-loka today and different funerary rites and really the esoteric process of death, or pulling back the curtain and seeing kind of the esoteric reality of death. So that's what we're going to get into today. And if you've been with me before, this lecture is going to be like my other ones, where I'll be here on YouTube, Rumble, and Facebook for probably about 2 hours for the entire lecture. And then I'm going to take questions from my members, and that is on my private website. So if you do want to participate in the question and answer section of this lecture, then go ahead and sign up now on my website and get your questions in, and I'll disappear here from the public and I will reappear behind on my website. So that's how this is going to go. All right, so the mystery of death, the mystery of death. So there are actually 7 great mysteries in the occult. And the idea is that if you understand these 7 great mysteries, then you'll sort of understand reality. You'll understand the world. You'll have all the keys of knowledge. So the 7 great mysteries are, number 1, the abyss. Number 2, the mystery of number. Number 3, the mystery of affinity. Number 4, the mystery of birth and death, which today we will just be covering death. We won't get into the rebirth process. Number 5, the mystery of evil. Number 6, the mystery of the word. And number 7, the mystery of godliness. So today we are going to get into, therefore, the 4th mystery, and only a part of it, which is the mystery of death. All right. So death is kind of, I think, morbid to our Western mind, but death has been a major part of every single religion, making up many times the majority of the rituals and initiations and the teachings centering around death, because the death process is actually synonymous with the initiation process. So in this way, when we fall asleep every night and our soul separates from our body, or our astral body separates from our physical and etheric body, we actually go through a little tiny death and rebirth, right? And when we go through really trying times in our life, what do we call that sometimes in pop spirituality or even psychology? We call that ego death. So even in times of our life, we go through this period of death and rebirth, right? We can even see it in the insect kingdom with, the butterfly who goes from a caterpillar and dies in a cocoon and is technically reborn as a different being. And this makes up the heart of spiritual initiation as well. Spiritual initiation is all about leaving a part of you behind that is no longer serving you, right? Shedding a robe and getting a new robe. So the reason why death and makes its own mystery, it's its own teaching, is because everything really centers around this process of death and rebirth. And so the more that we understand the process of death, the more we understand ourselves, and the more that we find, even in a practical sense, the more that we go back and we look at, different funerary texts from, say, Egypt, or say from Tibet, or things like this. We go back and look at that, we can also see them as being initiation texts. So you can't just read it as though, you can't just read ancient funerary texts and different teachings around death as being, incantations for the dead, or, just these mundane things. We have to read all of the work around death as being initiation rites, as much as they are about our soul passing and moving into higher spheres. So that's how we have to enter into this perspective. And when you do dive into the mystery of death and you start reading about it and learning about it, you'll notice that there's two sort of wings of how this is typically taught. The first way that we'll often see it is the subjective experience of death. So this is when in mystery science, it's described very much as the individual's personal experience. This is where we get the description of different trials, different sensations, and the visions of death, and sort of the experience, the inner experience of the soul as they pass through these different realms of the heavens or the underworld. Okay, so that's the personal subjective experience of death. There's also, and we see this more and more as we move towards kind of the Western scientific lens, which is you have the objective experience of death, which is now we begin to see more and more as time passes, a draw to understand, okay, well, what is actually objectively going on when someone dies? Not getting away from the personal experience, what realm of heaven are they in? Is that associated with a specific cosmic sphere? What is technically happening to the soul? Is there some kind of transfiguration going on? And so we can see that typically within different mystery teachings around death, there is this, beautiful subjective process that is there, which is the experience of it, even the experience of initiation, right? But then there's also the objective discussion around it, which is what is actually happening to the soul upon death. So the mystery of death can be observed in two ways: the subjective process, or the internal experience of the individual as they pass through the gates of death, and the objective process of death. Both of these perspectives make up classical mystery teachings and funerary texts. Okay. There's also one thing that I wanted to introduce here, which is kind of a little bit of a discrepancy when talking about the soul. So in our modern times, we talk about the soul, and it's sort of like the word for the soul is really the word for the individual being, the I, the essence. But if you look back into classical literature, esoteric literature, in which most of the modern teachings are boiled down from, we'll see that the actual I, the actual individuality, the actual essence, what we call a soul in modern times, is described a little bit differently. And this is important because when we're talking about death, we're talking about the I of the individual, the individuality. We're talking about that unique individual soul essence. And in like theosophy and anthroposophy and in classical mysticism, the soul is something different than the I. And so I want to just draw attention to that. There's a little bit of a difference there right off the bat. Should you decide to go in and study this more, the ego in anthroposophy is what many people would call the soul in modern spirituality. But it's so the ego and the I is basically interchangeable modern times with what we would call the soul. But back in the day, at the turn of the century, the soul was associated actually more with the astral body or a specific part of the energy body. So a little bit of the a little bit of discrepancy in language that we have to clear up right off the bat. So the I, sometimes called the ego in anthroposophy and theosophy, are similar to the soul in modern pop spirituality. The I or the ego is the eternal spark of God within each of us, or our individuality. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what it is to die. And from a spiritual perspective, we should not fear death. We should not be disgusted by death. We should not be repulsed by death. We seek to understand it. And so, as we move forward in today's lecture, some of the descriptions are going to get pretty gnarly. Some of the descriptions of different processes, even going into the darker side of some people's death experience, that can get pretty dark. But the reality is that, the true initiate is not going to run from these ideas. They're going to, with an even hand, be able to walk into them and get something from them, so keep this in mind. So what happens immediately upon death? So we know that the human being is not just a physical body, right? It's not just a bunch of molecules. It's not just a bunch of matter. The physical body has an etheric body, or sometimes called a life body, right? Which is the vitalizing spiritual force that gives essence and energy to the physical body. And the human being also has another component, which is the astral body. And then within the astral body is the I, or the true individuality. And that's really what we recognize as being the lowest, most tangible members of our being. There are, of course, higher members, but we don't really get into those until much later in human development, like actively working on them. So when there is a physical death, what happens is that the physical body dies. So the organs lose function and the body dies. Okay, just the body dies though. Your I is eternal. It goes on forever, right? In different forms and different, moves through the heavens and eventually will take a life in a different condition. So what happens exactly when the physical body dies? Okay, what happens is that all of the spiritual forces in the body begin to center into the heart center, the chamber of the heart center. And they begin to gather there and gather there and gather there. And then they usually begin to move up, and they actually go out of the head, out of the crown of the head. So that's actually how the etheric body, the astral body, and the I, as what we would call the spiritual substrate of the human being, all bound up together, that's how it actually begins to separate from the body. And at this point in time, the cord that attaches the astral body and the higher bodies to the physical body is disintegrated and it wears away. And so along with death, there is also the dissolution of what is called the silver cord. The silver cord being, sometimes when people talk about lucid dreaming or astral traveling, they look around and they see this silver cord following them around. And that is your literal connection of your astral body and your higher bodies with your physical body. So when you pass away, that cord disintegrates and is drawn back into the etheric and the astral body. So therefore, there technically is kind of a transubstantiation of the form again in the heart chakra, and then it moves up out of the top of the head. And basically, what happens from that point forward is dependent on the level of consciousness of the individual. Because as we're going to see in this lecture, one's individual level of consciousness determines pretty much everything about their death process. There is no process that is similar for anyone. And that's the incredible thing, but also I think can make teaching it difficult because you can't teach from that subjective place. Like sometimes I'll see on YouTube, and there will be this person that's like, I had a near-death experience and I have all the answers. And it's like, you can't gather all of the mysteries of the cosmos from like a subjective near-death experience. You can get part of it, right? You can get your piece of it from your own subjective experience. But in order to understand the actual structure of the spiritual planes and the structure of your actual being, you have to study that. You have to learn that, just like anything else. And so sometimes in spirituality, there's this idea that you can just divine anything. You can just go into the spiritual plane and pull it down and it's magically always true. And that's not the case. Someone who's genuinely serious about developing spiritually, you're going to need to study. You're going to need to learn spiritual science just like you would anything else, right? So that's why we're here today, is to really learn the spiritual science of death. So the spot at the head it's like a soft spot, and babies are usually very soft here when they're born, and you can probably actually feel it. It's right where the sutures of your cranium come together. Obviously, I'm not a baby, but I'm sure you can feel it, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. That is also called the Brahma Andhra in Eastern teachings. And that is the spot in which the soul tends to, especially in our modern times, release itself. It was a little different in the past, but in our modern times, that's typically where it goes. And that's the crown chakra. And I'm going to read something to you from a translation from the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Evan Wentz. And this is describing the how the astral body and etheric body and the eye together as one sort of spiritual mass begin to separate from the physical body. So here is what Evan Wentz has to say about that. According to Hindu belief, there are 9 apertures of the body which are the means of experience. A good exit is one which is above the navel, but the best exit is through the fissure on the top of the cranium, called the Brahma Andhra, or the lotus of 1,000 petals. So in different periods of human development, the death process was a little bit different. And this is one of the things that in spirituality is probably the most important thing to grasp when looking at development, but is so often not grasped, which is that the human system slightly changes all the time with the procession of the ages. So new organs are actually added, or spiritual organs are progressed, and how the human being actually interacts with the cosmos changes in sort of intensity. And so we don't notice it in our small life of maybe maximum 100 years, but there's actually a change in the form and in consciousness, like at least every 350 years in a big way. And so how the process of the soul releasing has also been different in the past. But typically today, most people will exit through the crown of the head, though in the past it was different, which is why you'll hear about these different sort of apertures, if you will, these different points in the energy body in which were more dominant in earlier periods. Now, there's something very interesting that I want to mention here about the death process. And I talked about this with my groups on my private membership site a few different times. And I've also mentioned it in my lecture called The Immortal Body, which is that there is something that can be called a wraith. Now, this is WRAITH. And a wraith is essentially when an individual has passed away and their etheric body is basically hovering around their physical body. So, what can tend to happen sometimes when people pass away, especially if there are a lot of material desires, but not all the time, it can happen in the case of shock as well, is that the etheric body won't fully dissolve for a while, and it will actually stay united with the physical body. And this is why people would sometimes look into a graveyard and they would see this figure, standing above a grave, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is a ghost, or they'll go to a funeral home and they'll get the glimpse out of the corner of their eye of something standing by a coffin, or just this etheric body that is still united with the physical body. And so this is called a wraith. And this has always been a problem, actually, in the occult, because you don't really want these etheric shells floating around the spiritual world that are kind of like these empty shells. And I'll leave it at that. But this is actually why cremation came into place and why cremation became popular, which was popularized, I believe, through the Theosophical Society, which was that if the physical body is cremated, then there is no chance of that wraith hanging around, and that etheric shell is sort of forced to dissolve, and that is actually most oftentimes actually better for the soul. So this is why, that cremation process came about, was because of, in the spiritual sense, because of the wraith. Okay. All right. So where technically does this I, right, the soul or the ego, I'm going to use those interchangeably, even though classically you may not see them used interchangeably. Where does it go upon death? Where does it exist technically within some kind of cosmology? So when we pass away, our etheric body will eventually dissolve. And then all that's left is the vehicle for us, is basically the astral body with our I inside. Now, remember, our I is our soul. It's our spark of our individuality. It's our consciousness, right? So that aspect actually sort of releases into what is called the moon realm, or the moon plane, or in Eastern traditions and in anthroposophy, it is called kama-loka. It's also called that in theosophy as well. So kama-loka is also cosmologically, you could see it as the moon plane, okay, the moon realm, the moon kingdom. And this doesn't mean that when you're passing away, your astral body and your I get together and go live and dance upon the moon. Okay, you're not living on the surface of the moon. You're living in basically another realm that is technically between the earth and the moon, that is also called like the sense realm or the desire realm. That's often how it's discussed in Eastern teachings, which go into quite a lot of detail about kama-loka and all the different lokas within kama-loka. So you'll find in the Eastern teachings especially that they got very thorough about the death process, good, bad, and the ugly. So the moon realm, or kama-loka, is an intermediary plane between the material world, right, our physical 3D earthly world, and what we would technically call heaven, or the higher planes. So kama-loka is an intermediary world. It's a twilight world that is between the moon and the earth, in a different substrate, in a different realm. I don't like using the word dimension or different vibration or different frequency, because the moon realm or any of the realms that we talk about today that are technically the heavens, they are not earthly matter vibrating faster than we can see. It's actually a different substrate. So the moon realm is actually a different substrate than earthly matter. Okay, as we're going to see, the mercurial plane of heaven is a different substrate than the moon plane and the earth plane. And each plane requires transubstantiation of the form to enter, which is where we're going to get into the idea of the different gates of heaven, and trials and purification and things like that, is because you can't just like change the vibrational frequency of an atom, right? Or speed it up, or do all these things that modern science thinks it can do by just messing around with an atom and get into these other realms. You can maybe disturb them or poke a hole momentarily, but you're not going to get into the Mars realm or the moon realm or the Venus realm by just messing around with physical matter. Actual human being has to take on, an actual human being has to transubstantiate themselves. And that is how you get into these higher planes. So there's no getting into eternalness like the heavenly planes without the law of transubstantiation or transformation or transfiguration. You have to change your form in order to rise into these higher and higher realms of heaven. And then when we reincarnate or we go through the process of rebirth, right, we're actually taking on more and more matter. And that is even a kind of excarnation or a kind of death where we're taking on. It's a different kind of transubstantiation to lowering, but it's still, you're still changing from one form to another. Okay. Our modern science does not acknowledge that, because it doesn't acknowledge the spiritual world. Okay. When a soul, so now we understand sort of like the technical position of kama-loka, and we have a little bit of a cosmology for it, a little bit of that objectivity coming in. Let's get into the subjective experience of kama-loka, the moon realm. What does that feel like when you pass into it? Now, every single person is going to have a different experience in kama-loka. No person's experience is going to be the same, because no person thinks the same thoughts, lives the same life, has the same challenges, has the same joys. So when you pass into kama-loka, your life is really reflected before your eyes. And in this sense, kama-loka, or you could also call it technically, it's very similar to the idea of the lower astral plane, right? Everything sort of moves backwards. Everything sort of moves in reverse, right, in the moon plane. And so, of course, when a soul begins to release itself into that, it's like a great unwinding. It's like a great unzipping, if you can imagine that. You know, you're used to going forward, now everything's going backwards. And so you can imagine how what spiritual process is that. Now, one of the things that happens is that there is a life review. And you've probably heard this before, that, you know, it's like I always hear, you know, someone fell off a ladder, or they were, you know, drowning, and their life flashed before their eyes. And this is actually true when you enter into kama-loka, because that plane, which you could also associate with the lower astral, that plane, again, it is a reversal. The spiritual effect of it is a reversal, an unwinding, and an unzipping. It moves backwards. What do you get when you have something that's used to moving forwards, going into backwards? You get a kind of fragmentation, yes, but you also get the experience of your life flashing before your eyes. And so upon entering kama-loka, and the body separated from the body, entering, expanding into kama-loka, the realm between the moon and the earth, suddenly the soul begins to review its life from the very end of it, going backwards to the very beginning. So there's a life review as soon as you pass away. And there's no one that gets an exception to this. This is part of the actual alchemy of death. And Rudolf Steiner actually talks about this in his lecture on kama-loka. And he says, and so after death, this is therefore the time of detachment. The whole life runs backwards through the astral world, and you live through your life once more from backwards to forwards. And you conclude it with the first impressions of your childhood. But this happens much faster here in the physical world and lasts about a third of your earthly life. Really interesting and specific details there, but really important because through that one sentence, we see that the lower astral world runs backwards. Compared to our forwards, it is a reversal. And here, of course, you get into the idea of the mirror realm of the moon. You get the idea of Alice entering into the psychic state and having to live in the mirror world, because the moon realm is also the realm of the psychic. It is also the realm that mystics have to enter into and technically work in, right? So you have to actually be very developed to not get caught up in that backwards nature of the moon realm in which all mystics have to live if they're working in the spiritual world, right? So the moon realm has this backwards, upside down nature, which is also portrayed often in different kinds of stories and literature about the moon, or just about initiation in general. There's always weird things going on. We talked about that in Edadorfa, which is an underworld tale. And it's also very clear in Alice in Wonderland as well. So you do have a life review, and that is the occult reason why you have a life review. And one of the things that Rudolf Steiner interestingly also mentioned is that to sort of make that process more succinct upon death, before you go to bed every night, you can actually review your day from the moment that you're going to sleep and then the moment that you woke up. And that is actually supposed to help clarify that experience. So we know that we have a life review, but we also have to sort of get into the part of kama-loka, and I think the death process, that people don't really want to think about. I think that in our society, we're so overwhelmed with different stresses, especially at this time, that there's an incredible desire to make the spiritual world a fairy tale, and to make the spiritual world something to escape into, to make the spiritual world a comforting thing. This is a very big mistake. We can't make the spiritual world whatever we want it to be just to make ourselves feel better. We can't project our desires onto the spiritual world. That will actually only cause pain, as we'll see. We have to see things objectively as they are and understand the processes. So when we go into kama-loka, we have to experience basically our inner world. So we have to experience our soul's level, especially of materiality. So the thing that becomes really apparent when the soul enters kama-loka is all of the material attachments that you have, all of the times in which you should have gone inward into your heart and connected with God and developed a spiritual union, right? And you actually decided to sink deeper into materiality. So instead of going inward, you engaged in some kind of lower urge or lower impulse. So there's all these different times in our life in which we can deepen our connection with God and we can become more spiritual, more awakened, or we can avoid that process and we can seek material pleasures. We can seek something like food, right? The desire to eat and have sensual physical pleasure with food. The sexual desires, you can get lost in sex and the physical pleasures. And that can stop you from actually examining yourself. You can get lost in all different kinds of sensuous things about the physical world that actually, when you engage in them for the sake of only pleasure alone, to hide from God within you, they draw you deeper and deeper and deeper down and deeper. And you don't realize it in your life. But when you come upon kama-loka, you start to see and feel very viscerally all of the times that you should have turned inward. Because in kama-loka, we are essentially a spiritual body. We no longer have physical sense organs. We no longer have eyes. We no longer have a mouth, ears. We no longer have, skin to sense with. We're in a completely different plane of existence and a completely different kind of body. And so we don't have the ability to actually experience any kind of physical pleasures or any kind of physicality whatsoever. And so there is a great thirst in occult literature. It's often described as a great thirst, a great desert, because there is the desire to fulfill certain holes and needs, but there's no ability to do that. And so that's why it's an intimidating part of our death process. So the soul's level of materiality is confronted, but also not just, we don't just have to confront the times in which we abandoned ourselves to seek, fame, or money's another one, like where you're just trying to have a better life by only focusing on fame or money or something like that, the physical things, what you can acquire, it's also how you have lived your life. Have you been a cruel person? Have you been selfish? Have you been also brave? You experience also the times in your life in which you behaved in a way that is technically beneath you as a spiritual being. So you experience sort of your own negative ego magnified. And so that has to be confronted and hopefully released through the death process. So in this way, your I, your individuality, your soul, your ego, your higher ego is sort of ennobled by this experience. Because if you have lived a spiritual life and you have, especially if you've improved from your last life, this experience can be still challenging, but you can actually be ennobled from it. And your soul can actually become more powerful because it's like you forged a higher existence, a higher, immortal body for yourself as you go through it. And then for other people who have not spent time in their life developing awareness relative to their own development, right? Everybody's different. They will be very fragmented by this experience, and they will not evolve, and they'll experience the weight and the pain of their unawareness. So a symbol for this, like really kind of reduced, has always been judgment. So you'll often hear, especially in Orthodox Christianity, that upon death we are judged. And, in occult science, it's not so much that there's like this guy sitting on a chair somewhere, this bearded God in heaven that's like sitting down on you and personally judging you as another being. That's not at all what judgment means. Judgment is sort of an experience. It's really just about equilibrium, but we say judgment because that's what it feels like. And so you'll often see that this part of the kama-loka experience is associated with judgment. You feel kind of judged. And a lot of most funerary texts and writings talk about this kind of judgment. And again, it's not some, extraneous being that's standing over you and judging your life, right? It's you actually coming into really a field of beings that make up that plane. And it is your reckoning against heaven that causes that. It's the difference between you and the heavenly forces that causes that alchemical reaction. So there's no, it's a more of a magnification process that is going on rather than a judgment, if that makes sense. And I think religions have taken this way too far, especially Orthodox Christianity, about being judged, and a lot of things about the death process have just not been taught properly in Orthodox Christianity, and it makes it people very fearful, which of course affects their death process, ironically. So the soul experiences kama-loka by basically experiencing all of its desires, all of its attachments, all of the stuff going on in your lower centers is magnified. You know, any unhealthy desires come forward, material pleasures, food, sex, power, control, money, all that's magnified, and you have to face all of that. And that makes a really powerful impression on the individual because, you know, in your life, oftentimes there's a sense of like, well, I have to be materialistic, or I have to be for myself, or I have to be this way. And there's no idea about how it really is for you spiritually. And so this process is so important for the soul because kama-loka shows the soul that this is how you're living. And it gives that soul an awareness so that it can then, it gets burnt into your soul essence, and you say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize this, essentially. And you get a chance then moving forward by looking at yourself. Remember, the moon realm was a mirror realm. You look at yourself quite viscerally, you feel it. And that allows you to in your next incarnation, get a better understanding of life, and you hopefully correct yourself. So I'm going to read a little bit from Anthroposophy about Rudolf Steiner says about kama-loka. And this is from the lecture Life of the Soul in Kama-loka from GA 95. This condition is called kama-loka, the place of desires. It is not some region set apart. Kama-loka is where we are, and the spirits of the dead are always hovering around us. But they are inaccessible to our physical senses. What then does a dead man feel? To take a simple example, suppose a man eats avidly and enjoys his food. The clairvoyant will see the satisfaction of his desire in a brownish red thought form in the upper part of his astral body. Now suppose the man dies. What is left to him is his desire and capacity for enjoyment. So he dies, but he still has this desire and capacity for physical enjoyment. To the physical part of a man belongs only to the means of enjoyment. Thus, we need gums and so forth in order to eat. The pleasure and the desire belong to the soul, and they suffer after death if you have desires. But the man no longer has any means of satisfying his desires, for the appropriate organs are absent. And this applies to all kinds of wishes and desires. He may want to look at some beautiful arrangement of colors, but he lacks eyes, or to listen to some harmonious music, but he lacks ears. So all of these physical comforts, all these things in which we try to create a spiritual state based in physical things, whether it be beauty or whatever it is, that becomes a great pain in kama-loka because we can only ever truly work upon ourselves from inside, right? How does the soul experience all this after death? The soul is like a wanderer in the desert, suffering from a burning thirst and looking for some spring at which to quench it. You'll notice this a lot. Rudolf Steiner here is using symbology from the Egyptian funerary text, the Book of Gates, the Book of the Dead, from the Tibetan mystery tradition, kama-loka is usually portrayed as being a desert and the individual burning of thirst, praying for cool waters of relief. That is the metaphor that's often used across traditions to describe kama-loka. The soul is like a wanderer in the desert, suffering from a burning thirst and looking for some spring at which to quench it. And the soul has to suffer this burning thirst because it has no organ or instrument for satisfying it. It has to feel deprived of everything, so that to call this condition one of burning thirst is very appropriate. This is the essence of kama-loka. The soul is not tortured from outside, but has to suffer the torment of the desires it still has, but cannot satisfy. So now you're getting into the idea too here of hungry ghosts and the idea of people wanting to, people who have passed on, even demonic entities wanting to live through people because of these incredible desires they have, and an inability to handle that. The more that we sink into materiality and look at the material world as all there is, the more painful death becomes, the more lost we become, the more lost in the desert we become. And so also there's this idea of Jesus going into the desert. That is him releasing materiality, finally, right? So being lost in the desert also symbolizes the releasing of, materiality from your soul and truly giving yourself to the spiritual world. Why does the soul have to endure this torment? The reason is that man has to wean himself gradually from these physical wishes and desires so that the soul may free itself from the earth and may purify and cleanse itself. When that is achieved, the kama-loka period comes to an end and man ascends into Devachan. Devachan is going to be synonymous with heaven, our idea of heaven. It's the closest thing that we have in the Western system to heaven. Okay, so I hope that gives you a good example of kama-loka and the moon plane and the soul releasing itself from physicality and what that process is like. I also find that Dion Fortune has a really good book about the death process, and it's called Through the Gates of Death. It's also under another title as well. And this is from page 49, and I think that it sums up the process of kama-loka and death in general very well. And she says, "But these are not the flames of eternal torment in kama-loka, but the cleansing fires that purify the soul as gold is tried in the furnace until its dross is burned away and is pure and precious." So alchemy is also another symbol for death as well. And what's really going on a greater scale, as we're going to see as we continue here in this lecture, is that the death process is largely seen as a harvesting, separating wheat from the chaff, a winnowing. And repeatedly, as the human soul passes through the different planes of the heavens, there is a separation occurring. What is ennobled and immortal, which we would call, as you know, the resurrection body, does not die. It's immortal. It passes through the gates whole, right? But then what is of a lower substance, of dross, as you'd call it in alchemy, that is left behind. And so this idea of moving through these flames is key in the first part of the death process that we're talking about today. So let's summarize what we've covered here. Okay. Kama-loka, or the moon realm, is the intermediary plane between the material plane and the higher spiritual planes, or Devachan. It is where the individual experiences their own thoughts, desires, and attachments to a heightened degree. The individual is either ennobled by this experience and changes course in its overall life journeys in the future, or they fall deeper into degeneration. The experience of purification is not the experience of purification is not inflicted onto the individual by another being, some God on high. Instead, they experience their own mind, their own emotions and desires to a heightened degree, to a magnified degree. So it's a magnification. Thus, kama-loka is a realm of purification and transition from the material life into the spiritual life. No soul may pass into the higher spiritual world or heaven unless they pass through the purifying flames and mirror of kama-loka. All right. So specifically what makes kama-loka difficult is like if you're doing acts of cruelty, if you're doing harm towards yourself, if you're harming other people. Cowardice is another thing that is sometimes not mentioned, but if you have opportunities in your life to be brave and to, make a difference or support someone or whatever, and you cower away from them, and that opportunity dies on the vine because you're afraid, you're living in fear. Cowardice is also very difficult to face in kama-loka. It's not always just the aggressive harms you do towards yourself or to others. It is also periods of cowardness that can be difficult as well because you're being closed off. And so what makes kama-loka an easier experience is that you live a life where you're actually communing with God, you're actually connecting to the spiritual world and aware of it. That makes kama-loka much easier, and you process a lot of your karma, you process a lot of your negative energy that you would be confronted with all at once in kama-loka. You process it throughout your life when you're spiritually aware. So that causes a much easier death. And as I've mentioned before, most mystery schools heavily focused on the death process, and they would train people on how to die properly, right? There's that incredible clip of George Harrison from the Beatles that I'm reminded of, where he was very into Eastern mysticism, and when he was getting close to die, he was doing all of these Eastern techniques in order to die properly. And when he passed away, his widow said that she entered the room, and the room was just full of all of this light because George Harrison had taken on all of these, mystery practices in order to die properly. And so it's considered, when you start to really understand spirituality and you understand kama-loka, you realize that there's a certain way to live, there's a certain way to be. And that definitely happens, I think, as the soul becomes more seasoned as well. But certainly, traditionally, in different mystery cults, it was all about how to die properly so that you weren't, passing into the kama-loka unaware, and you were getting the most out of every life. So it's also very difficult in kama-loka when people have no connection with God, and they're just sort of living from this materialist place, and they have no concept of God, and therefore they're not able to connect with God. That's also very shocking to the individual as well, because they don't believe in spirit, and then they pass away, and suddenly it's like, whoa, what is this? So that can be very shocking. And one of the questions that I knew was going to come up today, even though this is more of a technical lecture on death, is what can you do to help your loved ones through this process? I'm sure some people are like, I just lost my grandmother, my grandfather, a family member, friend, and I'm hearing about them going into kama-loka, the burning desert of thirst, and what can I do? And actually, earlier religions spent a lot of time in different death rituals. I mean, this is obvious just from, the different death texts that existed that were full of little rituals that would probably be seen more as superstitions today, but there were all kinds of spells and rituals and superstitions around death in every single culture, where people would try to help the soul pass into the underworld properly with a lot of support. And so this is why we pray at funerals and things like this. But that's another lecture entirely on the different customs and prayers that were associated with helping your loved ones pass over. But what I can say is that if you have someone who has passed away, they do hear your prayers, they do hear your thoughts, they do hear your good intentions. They're just in another plane, they're not gone entirely. And so if you have somebody who has passed away and you're wanting to help them, one of the best things that you can do is pray for them. And you can pray that this experience be lighted by Christ, by angels. You can pray that they experience the comfort of your love, the comfort of God's love, because the comfort of your love, the love that you cultivate for the world, is really your greatest comfort in kama-loka. It's the one thing that never dies and that survives in every single plane as you pass through it, is your love for humanity, your love for others and yourself. That is the thing that creates a soft landing. And so when you send them love, when you send them prayers, that can actually really help your deceased relative, your deceased friend. You can also light a candle for them, a white candle, and send them prayers and angels and things like that. And that can actually help them through that process. All right. So let's go really deep into the death process now, into sort of what the different mystery traditions have said about it. So as I mentioned earlier, when you start studying initiation, like just the different grades of initiation, and I'm not even talking about like dark and weird secret societies that have tried to institutionalize actual spiritual processes. I'm talking about real initiation that is between you and God and you and angels, that has nothing to do with, people getting together and trying to mirror that in this world. The spiritual initiation is primarily not based in another human being or an organization. It's based in your relationship with God and you stepping through the stages from unconsciousness to consciousness. That's what initiation is. So to make that clear, because there's so much superstition and fear, I think, of secret societies, and we think that initiation is only a word that's associated with that. No, it belongs to you. It belongs to your soul. That is a word that exists outside of those weird organizations. Okay, so the death process is identical to the initiation process. So if you're reading like different initiation texts about like, Orpheus goes into the underworld, right? So in the meditation or a dream, you have these different characters that, transcend into the underworld. Alice goes into the underworld, the underground, and Etidorfa, that happens as well. Persephone does. These are actually obviously initiation rites, but they're also basically following the exact process of death as well. So death and initiation are parallel. They cannot be separated. They're the same symbology oftentimes, just used in different contexts. So some of the symbology that we see this is symbology, imagery, metaphor, wording that exists across all traditions. We can see the progression of these teachings as humanity evolves into different religions. So the first one obviously is descent. Now this descent is often called, descending into the underworld, into Hades, right? But really it's actually a descent into yourself. So when you pass away, even, you're not technically obviously in your physical body, but how the spiritual world works is that the best way that we can understand it is that you're actually descending into your own soul. Because when you enter into the spiritual world, you experience that world as you are. And you reckon with what it truly is, if that makes sense. And that's what causes the trials and challenges and things like that, is that you enter it as you are with all of your warts and everything, right? And then you're constantly sort of spiritually also confronted by higher essences, right? So this idea of, and that's what makes initiation. So this idea of descent is very important, descending into the underworld, which is also associated with like the inner spheres of the earth and anthroposophy. It's also associated with obviously your own inner world, right? The underworld is your inner world. That's how we experience the underworld. It's also often shown as passing through different gates, or in the Eastern tradition, it is progressing through what are called different lokas, Lokas. So you're passing through these different gates, these different planes or lokas, and each has a different quality to it that you have to essentially match in order to pass through, or master to pass through. And you can see that a lot of video games are also very much following this. You know, they even have deities like a boss at the end, and there's different levels. That's very much kind of an underworld thing. The other thing, and we're going to kind of focus on this a bit today, is the feeling of, or the metaphor of the desert, and also the idea of fire and the idea of heat and thirst. So you'll often see this in different teachings and descriptions of initiation and death. And you'll also notice that there's a transfiguration, as I mentioned, that happens at every time you get to a different loka or a different gate. And so it's also really a process of alchemy in that way. And another thing that you'll see commonly with death myths or initiation myths is this battling with these different deities that have a symbolic qualities to them that represent the different vices that we have, or different specific sin. And so there's always these different trials and battles that are part of the death process, or the journey, one's journey through the underworld. So if you look at this, there's an incredible book. Well, it's not really a book. It's actually on Seti the First's tomb in Egypt. They found that there was this incredible funerary text that was etched into his tomb, and also, I believe, scrolling across the walls. And it was the most complete funerary text I think that they had that was sort of very specific. They had the Book of the Dead and another one. There's a couple of funerary texts that are very famous in Egypt, but the Book of the Gates is very specific. And it's basically has Ra, and Ra is in his like solar bark or his solar barge, and he's passing through the different stages of the underworld, of the kama-loka, and even of the heavenly planes. And in the Egyptian Book of the Gates, the death journey for them is broken up into 12 different hours, or 12 distinct phases the soul must pass through, 12 distinct conditions, 12 challenges the soul must pass through. And it's even called the inner desert. And hour 2 is called the watcher of the desert. So there you have the same symbology being used in Rudolf Steiner's lectures on kama-loka as in the Book of the Gates, which is, the Book of the Gates is not what the Egyptians called it. It's what Europeans called it when they discovered it. But it's the same sort of wording that's on the inscriptions. And when Ra is in his solar barge and he's going through all of these different gates, these different hours, he is battling usually with serpent deities. And you'll also see that in the death myths and initiation rites, when it goes back into funerary texts and just occult literature, usually the individual is confronted by serpents, right? And serpents are kind of funny because they're viewed as holy, but they're also viewed as evil. And that is because they represent just pure raw life force energy. Life force energy, when purified, can be the most holy, perfected thing imaginable. But if the individual's life force energy or serpent force is cloudy and polluted from wrong living, right, then that serpent is portrayed as evil. And so as Ra is going through the 12 hours in his solar barge, He's confronting basically these serpent deities that represent his sort of unrefined, chaotic lower forces, right? So that's being that the experience of death here is being shown as confronting our lower self as these different serpent deities that are embodying our lower nature. They're personifying our lower nature. We battle it. And there's also, very interestingly, there's also these lakes of fire. There's one in the Book of the Gates that is basically, I believe it's the Book of the Gates, where it's literally just like a flaming lake of fire with a bunch of like baboons hanging around it. So I don't know what's going on there, but it looks weird. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It's fine. It's totally fine. So Ra casts the enemies. So Ra also casts his enemies into these lakes of fire. So he's doing battle, but then he's also kind of casting his enemies, or you could really see that as his lower aspects, into this lake of fire to be further transmuted. And he also has this idea of deities supporting him. They're not doing it for him, but he's surrounded by these different spiritual beings. He's in their world. He's within these spiritual beings. He's not in a plane that has spiritual beings. He's literally within spiritual beings. When we pass into kama-loka, we are literally within the moon beings. We pass into these higher planes. We are not in a simulation. We are moving within beings, And so that is portrayed in the Book of the Gates and these carvings as these deities that are surrounding him. And so while we're there, this is the angelic hierarchies, and they are supporting people through this process. They're not doing it for them, but they are helping to create the proper conditions for that person. And so you'll see these different deities that represent different forces that are helping to create that experience for Ra, or for us, as we pass through the 12 gates of death, or that's how it's portrayed in the Egyptian death texts. And so you can imagine that, here he is in a solar barge. He's facing the serpents that are spitting fire at him, but he also, as he goes, he's also kind of learning to wield the fire and enlighten the darkness in front of him. So he's learning, which is very symbolic as well. And Ra becomes more and more rarefied as he passes through all of these 12 hours or 12 gates. As he confronts all of these archetypal entities that represent his lowest urges, he becomes more rarefied, more purified, tossing off these lower aspects to be reassimilated, if you will, or remelted down in the lakes of fire that surround him. Very alchemical imagery here. And so, as I said earlier, Ra, which is the metaphor for all of us, is really passing through his own inner world. Right? That's also what that represents. Now, that's the Egyptian Book of Gates, but let's see what Christianity, especially Orthodox Christianity, not esoteric Christianity, but Orthodox Christianity, and the Bible says about kama-loka and even the different planes. So in Orthodox Christianity, the closest thing we have to kama-loka is or the moon plane is purgatory. So when we hear about the idea of purgatory and that kind of in-between transitionary phase, that's the same thing as the lunar plane, right? Or kama-loka. That's in Orthodox Christianity. They're describing purgatory. Okay, well, the Eastern traditions are talking about kama-loka. Anthroposophy calls it kama-loka. And cosmologically, we could see that as the moon plane, all right? And there's also hell in Orthodox Christianity, because by the time Christianity rises, the church fathers really needed to usher in the individual, because humanity had been so deep in the Eastern traditions, which was basically about dissolving the spirit back into the all that is. And humanity had to sink deeper and deeper into individuality. We couldn't dissolve ourselves into the all that is, right? We have to become individuals and spiritualize as an individual. And so, Christianity had to take on the task of the individual, right? Of individual realization, of individuality, which was not the task of the Eastern traditions as much. And so that's why they're so different. But that's also why, especially in Orthodox Christianity, you see so many esoteric teachings left behind, is because at that time, those were teachings that were sort of considered to be distracting for the development of the individual, which was the task that needed to be done. We need to become individuals, right? We can't just live in like a hive mind, right? Which is what dissolving into the all is. We have to become individuals. So that's the difference between East and West. There's beauty in both, right? But we have to know how one transitions into the other. So the idea of hell is basically the space that would be beneath kama-loka. And there's if you look into the Eastern traditions, you'll be surprised at how many different kinds of hell realms there are. People think that, Christianity is so unforgiving. It's so dark in its death perspective and so damning and fire and brimstone. Well, if you think that's bad, I challenge you to read about the Naraka plains and the many different layers of hell and how gruesome they're explained. The reality is that no matter the tradition, no matter the religion, each one has a version of hell, a version of purgatory, and the hell descriptions are never great. Okay, so they're all there. How they were, brought about or believed by different people is one thing, but they exist within the scriptures. So hell, the idea of hell does exist in other traditions as well, but I think it's described a bit differently, where it's kind of like a lower level of kama-loka going into the subnatural world. And it's sort of like what cannot pass through is fragmented away into what you would call hell. And this would be called the Vici in the Eastern tradition. Very similar to the idea of the 8th sphere. And it's kind of like, the soul would pass into these, lakes of fire and then be forced to reamalgamate in a different form into, would be considered the subearthly realm, kind of back into this elemental existence. So that would be the closest thing to hell. So we talked about Ra and Ra's lakes of fire, and this obviously appears in Revelation, and it says, "And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever." So here is again this idea of Ra casting his enemies and lower aspects into the lake of fire to burn and to be, in a sense, perhaps we would say modern times, reamalgamated into a lower, even yet a lower loka, a lower form, if you will. And I also wanted to bring this quote from the Bible as well, which deals with burning and purification, but also dismemberment. And what was interesting in, again, the different funerary texts and occult teachings is there's also usually this theme of dismemberment. So the body being literally cut apart and put back together, or pulled apart and sort of being put back together. This is also used in Eastern traditions, Egyptian traditions, this idea of being reconfigured, basically fragmented apart and being reconfigured. And so I thought it was interesting that there was it kind of reminded me of this in Mark 9:43. And this is what Jesus says. He says, "And if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed than having 2 hands to go to hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched." So I just found that really interesting, that here again we see this fire idea and also this idea of dismemberment. Another thing that does appear in Christianity that does mirror Egypt and other texts is this idea of these 12 gates. So we know that Ra is cruising around in his solar barge in the underworld, and he's passing through 12 hours or 12 gates. And this is also mentioned in Revelation when they talk about basically heaven being 12 gates surrounding heaven and leading into heaven. And he said, the city had a wall great and high and had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Now we also see in the idea of the 12 gates in the Egyptian tradition, every hour there is a kind of deity that must be confronted, kind of good and bad. And so here we're actually kind of seeing the same thing, talking about heaven, with the idea of these deities and angels there at every gate. Very, very, very similar concept. Now, what does Buddhism have to say about this process of burning, of even gates, things like that? So Buddhism and the Eastern traditions in general have very interesting traditions and ideas around death. And one of the things that I really liked within the Eastern tradition is that the way they describe it is, I think, great, which is they say that you basically wake up in a different world, and that every realm of the underworld or every realm of the heavens is essentially like a different life that you wake up in. And I think that that's an important thing to grasp, because we're often like, well, how does that happen? Like, what is that experience? And how they describe it is that it's basically like you're waking up from a dream. So when you pass here, right, it's like you wake up as though this is a dream in kama-loka. And then once you live that life in kama-loka, or one of the realms within kama-loka that they describe, depending on the essence of your soul, right, then you sort of go to sleep or you die, and then you wake up in yet another plane. And so how the Eastern way describes it is this period of like a dream within a dream within a dream. And that's accurate, in my opinion, is that's how that feels. Very strange to think about, but that's also why we dream and wake up in this life. But it's the same sort of process. But in in Buddhism, like I said, they have a very intense idea of, I would say, this burning process that we've been talking about. The underworld for them and kama-loka for them is divided into distinct states. It's a bit more detailed. Like there are different levels of what we would sort of consider the underworld that are specifically described according to deeds. Like certain deeds will bring about certain experiences, but they use a lot of the same language that we see in Christianity, that we saw in the Eastern texts, one of which was this idea of, for some souls who have lived like a darker life, they will experience in the what would be called like the hell realms, if kama-loka doesn't go so well, I guess, that they're walking in a tightrope over a cauldron of fire, basically a boiling cauldron of fire. And there was this one text that sort of describes something very similar to actually the idea of Edgar Cayce, who obviously came around a lot later after this was written, but this is very similar to actually Edgar Cayce's description of Saturn and the soul, and this idea of kind of like the lower dross of the soul that is cast off through the death process, that kind of gets reconstituted. It gets boiled in lakes of fire, or it just gets reconstituted in some way, right? So I'm going to read you a text from the 2nd century that describes this, and then I'm going to read you how Edgar Cayce describes it. So in the English translation of this Buddhist text is the world of transmigration, and it's from the 2nd century. I cannot pronounce the way that it's said in the Tibetan, the Tibetan wording, but that's the English translation. And it says there, the 6th and 7th great hells are the Tapana and the Pratapana. There are 2 great copper cauldrons there. The first is called Nanda, and the second, Upanananda. They are filled with boiling brine. The Rakasa demons, the guardians of hell, throw the damned into them. The damned are boiled and dissolved. So this is the exact same idea that we're seeing in Christianity. It's the same symbology that is being portrayed in the Egyptian tradition. There is this idea, this clairvoyant vision of this reconstitution through heat and boiling in matter. So I found that very interesting, because there is this symbology as well with Edgar Cayce that always kind of stuck into my mind, which is how he described Saturn. And the soul's sort of relationship with Saturn. Saturn being a planet of reconstitution. And even Rudolf Steiner talks about this, but not in the same way. But basically, the path of hyper-fragmentation and then dissolution and amalgamation is associated with the planet Saturn. And I would see that as, in my opinion, the passage of sort of lower human forces and essences that cannot be transmuted, like the dross, kind of being reconstituted and going into the natural sub-earthly world. You know, that's sort of how I see that. So this is where Edgar Cayce talks about Saturn as this reamalgamation point in heaven. And this is from his book, Planetary Sojourns. And he says, it's reading 311 and 2. I'm not going to read the whole thing because we just don't have time for that today. I have so much to cover. But it's in 311.2, and the book is Planetary Influences and Sojourns. And he's describing each sphere, right? Mercury, Venus, the different constitutions and what the spheres do in the heavenly world to the soul, right? After death. And then he describes Saturn in this way. As in Saturn, that to whom all insufficient matter is cast for remolding. All right. So there is that idea in the heavens of all of the parts of our being that are not ennobled, that are not pure, right? And this is the idea of, I just lectured a few months ago on the resurrection body, or in the Eastern traditions, the body immortal, the diamond body, the Vara. Okay, that is the only thing, again, that passes through the kama-loka and all these purification processes whole. Everything else is kind of cast aside and pulled into this reamalgamation process where it goes into the sub-earthly plane, right? And now I think we can put it together that process cosmologically, although it's described as being tossed into the lake of fire in different traditions, I think we can perhaps associate that with Saturn. Whereas Edgar Cayce said, to whom all insufficient matter is cast for molding, Rudolf Steiner has also mentioned that in the death process, Saturn is where the final amalgamation takes place before the soul enters the physical world. So I think we can cosmologically place Saturn as the amalgamator, right? All right. Spiritual fire and heat is the mechanism that alchemically purifies the soul essence as it passes through various levels of the spiritual world. This holy fire is the rarefied force of pure spirit. You'll often hear that. You'll often hear about how, the flame bearers, or you'll hear about fire being associated with the pure essence of spirit, unincarnated spirit, basically pure, raw spiritual energy. So this is why the imagery of fire is used. Holy fire is the rarefied force of pure spirit that every soul must weight itself against and one day become like. This holy fire is the alchemical fire of spirit that separates the lower ego from the higher I. This process is often symbolized as passing through gates or subplanes in which the individual must confront the conflicting dynamics within their own inner being. The experience is never the same for everyone. The spiritual matter of the individual's energy body that is darkened and fallen is cast back into the earthly elemental world and cannot pass onward. It's like when in Lord of the Rings, I think when he's like, the wizard's like, you shall not pass, or the ring pass not. That's also associated with Saturn. That's right, you cannot pass through certain rings of heaven unless you have a purified and noble resurrection body, which is also why the doctrine of resurrection is a spiritual doctrine, and it's a spiritual doctrine of eternal life, because your resurrection body, or your body immortal, is the only thing that survives whole when you pass away. So it quite literally is eternal life, conscious life. The other theme I wanted to get into today that I think describes the first periods of death very well is dismemberment and the fragmenting. So this idea of dismemberment appears throughout different traditions. It's kind of like this reconstitution, the soul being taken apart or unzipped and then reconstituted. It's also kind of like a transfiguration, because the reason why the soul is being challenged in that way is because it's exposed to a heavenly force that's higher than itself through the death process. And it's also a transformation. And the way that it's symbolized often in different traditions is this idea of harvest. So how the death process was symbolized, and even like with the different Egyptian mummies, when they have they're X'd, they're crossed, and they have the hook and the flail. It's a reference to winnowing, to harvesting and sowing. And a lot of the agriculture symbology is spiritual symbology. It's not necessarily actually about like sowing seeds in agriculture. It's really talking about the spirit, right? It's a metaphor. So the idea is separating the wheat from the chaff, which is winnowing, harvest, which is really just alchemy, right? The more spiritual fire that is applied to the human soul as it is released, the more the separation occurs, which is pure alchemy, right? Only the resurrection body survives that. Only the immortal body survives these processes, right? And that immortal body is created from a life of right living, of nobility, of true nobility, in the sense of being loving, of being kind, of everything we know to do. That's what creates that body and establishes it in the fires of heaven as we pass through. That passing through all those trials is literally what solidifies and constitutes your resurrection body. That's what creates it, right? That's the fires that forge it, life after life. And so there's this idea in these different spiritual texts from different traditions that the soul is being taken apart and either put back together again, or, the parts that can't be put back together again are cast into Saturn, or cast into a lake of fire, or whatever symbology is being used. And so there's this idea that really what's happening with the soul is it's being kind of reorganized according to heavenly order. That we are fallen, and fallen meaning we are in the material world, we're in the earth, and we are surrounded by just as much darkness as we are light. And so when we pass away, we're essentially reorganized according to heavenly order. And that is another way you can view sometimes the symbology of being dismembered. And I'm going to give you some of that symbology now. So I'm going to go back to the Egyptian book of Gates. And Ra is actually talking about being dismembered or reconfigured in the first hour of the book of Gates. And he says, basically, I'm going to read you the actual text, but he basically announces that upon entering death, that the completed souls, or the ennobled souls, or souls who have a resurrection body established, they shall pass through unscathed, but other individuals who are not trotting that path may be fragmented and tossed aside. So, I mean, there's just sometimes it gets pretty brutal in how it's described. So the translation that I chose is actually from Josephine McCarthy, and this is her book where she translates the Book of the Gates, and she calls it Book of Gates, a Magical Translation. And this is, I believe, around the first hour, and Ra is depicted as looking out into the desert or looking out into kama-loka, and he says, "Be bright, desert. It shines at you what is in me. Dismembering of people who are filled, of people who are finished. No dismembering of you who are gods. Breath for you, in whom am I? Brightness for you, underworlders. My Aket is yours. I ordain their dismemberment. There is a selection for them and for all. I have hidden from you those atop the earth. Provided is the ribbon for the best of the desert. Says these who are gods, influential in this bread, the ordaining words of the great God, when he exalts and refines his members. Come then to us, we who have come from in him. It is the great God of myriad developments. Their gifts are bread and beer." So Ra he's in his solar barge, he's looking out, and he is experiencing the death process on behalf of everyone and letting you know how it's going to go. And he says that there is the dismembering of people who are finished, no dismembering of you who are gods. Meaning that if you have that power of God within you, if you have your resurrection body established, going back to my original lecture, then you pass through whole. You're not dismembered, you're not torn apart. But people who are basically not completing in that journey, they are dismembered. There is a dismembering going on. There's a fragmentation going on. Here again is the separating of the wheat from the chaff. The wheat here is the resurrection body, the immortal body, that it passes through all chambers of death unscathed, purified as it is. It's something that we build day to day in our normal life. Again, I've lectured on the resurrection body. All right. So this idea of dismemberment also exists within Eastern traditions in Buddhism, just like in Egypt. There are these different examples of people going through the gates of death and basically being pulled apart and dismembered, being reconfigured. And so one of the examples was basically crushing the body into different pieces. Again, Buddhism has a very intense description of the darker planes. It's very specific. Another one was basically a body being dismembered and pulled apart by a bird. The one I'm going to read to you from a book called The Treatise on the Great Virtue of Wisdom, which is a translation of, again, a very early exploration of the lokas. This is describing something called the Kala Sutra realm, which means the black string realm. It's a realm of dismemberment, very similar to the Egyptian Book of Gates. And this is what it said, okay? Worker demons ceaselessly measure the damned with a black cord, Kala Sutra. With an iron axe, they put them to death and cut them to pieces. They shorten what is long. They lengthen what is short. They round off what is square. They square off what is round. They cut their arms and legs, tear out their ears and noses, and cut off their hands and feet with a great iron saw. They amputate them and cut them up. They cut their flesh into pieces and weigh the quarters of meat. So here again, we have this idea in these different traditions that the soul is weighed, it is measured. This is the same thing in the Egyptian tradition, it's the same thing in Christianity, it appears in Hinduism. It's the idea of being weighed, being measured. The body's measured with a black cord. It's dismembered. This dismembering is symbolic of the reconfiguration, but the actual soul does experience this as an experience, and so that is the Eastern version of that. And there were several different. It was actually hard because in esoteric Buddhism, there's so many different descriptions of the different realms that it was hard to choose which one to bring about. But if you're interested, it's a very interesting field of study. So this actually reminded me of a modern initiation myth, which is Alice in Wonderland. The idea of, they were trying to lengthen what was short, and they were trying to round off what is square. And this idea of everything being backwards and upside down and inverted, that is that mirror energy of the lower astral being described as a story in Buddhism. And it is also this dismemberment that occurs of the soul being in the kama-loka and other realms. So it reminded me very much of Alice in Wonderland, because Alice in Wonderland is a classical initiation myth. It is about entering the underworld, just like Orpheus, just like Persephone, just like, the very Dante, right? It is the same structure. And of course, we have the character Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty is dismembered when he falls apart and couldn't be put back together again. So this again is using that dismemberment theme. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, right? And all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. This is a dismemberment piece from a death myth or an underworld myth called Alice in Wonderland, which is a modern version of an initiation myth. But Lewis Carroll is using the same themes that you would find in, the esoteric Buddhism, in the Egyptian Book of the Gates. And even the same concept also appears in Christianity. And it doesn't appear the same kind of brutal ways that dismemberment appears in other traditions. But in Matthew 6:22, there is the famous quote that does refer to this process, which is, "If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light." If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. So if the individual remains intact or not dismembered, it remains single. It is illuminated by the Christ, by the light. Okay, this is a description of the resurrection body and it remaining intact throughout the death process, and it is eternal. It is single, it is eternal, it is not dismembered. Through a spiritual life, the individual unites with Christ through their eye and individuality, which makes them eternal and immortal. It makes them full of light. The light is the life. In this case, nothing is separated, and the immortal body is constructed. In this case, nothing is separated, nothing is dismembered. The immortal body is constructed and passes unscathed through death. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. It is unadulterated. Okay, single. So it is common in spiritual traditions to see that the soul's experience in the underworld is portrayed as periods of fragmentation or dismemberment. This is describing the soul's reckoning process with more perfected, higher spiritual forces. Thus, the soul experiences a kind of judgment, a kind of reorientation, which happens not existentially, but to their actual being, their actual soul essence experiences this. Every time they are dismembered or reoriented, it represents the opportunity to confront a part of their life, archetypally speaking, that they did not understand. So every single time someone is pulled apart, separated, reversed, or put backwards, right? That is a metaphor in the actual experience of the soul having to confront something that it did not understand. It's being reconfigured, all right? The theme of wholeness when passing through the underworld denotes the completion or the perfection of the individual. This dismembering of the soul essence into two streams is also portrayed as separating the wheat from the chaff, or harvesting, the great harvest. What is of a lower selfish nature is cast aside as a personal etheric dross. It cannot pass further into the higher planes and remains connected to the earth at an elemental level. Of course, when the soul comes back around to reincarnate, that is picked up again by the soul. That dross is picked up again. That was cast into the fire before. It cannot pass further into the higher planes and remains connected to the earth at an elemental level. What is ennobled survives unscathed and passes into heaven whole. This ennobled etheric spiritual essence is called the immortal body, the resurrection body, or the diamond body, or the Vara body. There's many different names for it depending on the tradition. Thus, we build our resurrection body over time, life after life after life. And eventually, through right living, we free ourselves from the need to reincarnate. We achieve eternal life. So the boiling, the dismembering, the sowing of the wheat from the chaff, all of that is actually describing the construction of your immortal body, of what in esoteric Christianity we would say the glorified phantom or the resurrection body. That is created, and when you pass away, instead of being dismembered, instead of being boiled, you are basically whole. That's the goal. That is eternal life, right? Thine eye be single, okay? So let's get into another part of the death process that I knew was going to add a little bit more time to this lecture, but I felt like we really needed to add on to this, which is the idea of the planetary spheres and the death process. So I'm going to cover this, a small bit of Devachan, and then I am going to take your questions on my streaming platform. So if you have any questions that are brewing, now is a good time to go ahead and sign up. I will basically take about a 5-minute break, and then I will reappear over there, and I'll be taking your questions for probably about another hour or so. So if you have any questions and you want to participate, go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we've talked about the subjective sort of experiences of death and like the different things the soul goes through metaphorically, you know, the best that we can possibly imagine as being a physical person, you know. But what is the objective sort of location of the soul essence? Like where is it sort of ascribed to that we can relate to in our physical realm? Now, we can't really hyper literalize or materialize the death process or the spiritual world, but we can realize that sort of what's called the firmament or the starry sky and the planets are basically a picture of heaven. Okay. It is a representation of heaven, of the higher planes. It's not the higher planes, okay? It is a representation of the higher worlds, okay? So now we're going to get into the reality that the soul passes through these gates, and these gates are really associated with different planetary spheres. And so the other aspect of the death process is that when the soul leaves the body, obviously it passes into the moon sphere, which is the transitory realm. Then it passes into the Mercury sphere. Then it passes into the Venus sphere. Then it passes into the Sun sphere, and then Mars, and then Jupiter, and the Saturn sphere, and then it reincarnates on Earth. So in reality, the death process from an objective standpoint, and why they looked at the sky and said, oh, that's the heavens, right? That's where spirits are, is because that orbital plane, like the orbital plane from the Earth to Mercury, is a plane of heaven. The orbital plane from Earth to, Venus to Sun to Mars, it's that orbital plane that is a realm of heaven. It's not that the soul is like living on the planet. The planet is representing a plane in the spiritual world. Okay, which is why the planets were actually viewed spiritually and not just seen as like some physical scientific thing. It's only in modern times, like in the last 200-300 years, that the planets have become these physical rocks that we can mine and control and colonize and all that. This is a sickness. This is not how we traditionally view the spheres in a healthy society with a healthy mind. Okay, so we have to understand that. And quite frankly, we can see with technology, there is an intense desire to try to control the death process, to avoid the death process, even to the point where certain groups want to colonize Mars to control the death process there. And there are deep, deep, deep occult reasons why certain secret societies want to colonize Mars. Okay, it has to do with the order in which certain planets swing to life and die. There's a deep occult reason why they want to center human origins around Mars, why they want to colonize Mars. And the public is being told basically a bunch of lies. Well, they have this occult, esoteric reason underneath. And so it has to be known and it has to be spoken that when we understand the process of death and reincarnation, we'll also understand heaven, right? And what they're doing is actually trying to bypass death. They're trying to bypass the process of dismemberment, the process of the lakes of fire. They're trying to avoid that through a very specific occult process that uses technology to sort of reconfigure the human being so they don't have to go through the death process. Okay, so this also has to do with Mars coming into a certain influence once the Earth ascends. So when we understand the occult reality of the planets and our relation to them, then we can understand why so many people are wanting to do things with the moon. They're wanting to do things with Mars. There's all this stuff going on. And quite frankly, we are being told lies, and, we need to really brush up on our ideas and understanding of the spiritual world. So we're going to move now again from that personal objective experience of the soul going through all these different challenges and trials and all of that to sort of where is the soul in heaven? How can we see that represented in the sky, right? So remember, whenever the soul is going to a different plane, right? In the New Age, this is like, it's going to a different dimension, and there's this machine that's going to, transform your body through some gross material process. It's going to transform it into the fifth dimension. It's going to, the fifth dimension or this dimension or the 12th dimension. That's not possible. The only way you can pass into the higher planes, which is what the dimensions are trying to portray, but they're doing a hyper materialistic job of, those are inner planes, and they can only be reached through a process of transfiguration or transubstantiation. So you can't actually go into what the New Age calls the fifth dimension, right, or heaven, unless you go through kama-loka, unless you go through all these spiritual transformations. That's what initiation is. There's no machine, okay? There's no machine that's going to make you live forever. There's no machine that's going to bring you into different times, time travel. There's no machine that's going to be able to really do that. Okay, machines can't do that. The human being can do that when they become an advanced initiate, and they can perhaps influence technology from that level, but it's always, always, always the human being that is the mechanism of advancement, always. It's never something outside. We don't evolve because technologies are developed. That's an externalist, materialist perspective that destroys the soul. The only time humanity has ever evolved, has ever created something great, a high culture, high society, high something or other. The only time that has ever happened is through a human being, somebody who was an advanced initiate gifting it to the world. It has never occurred through a machine. Okay, so I want that to be very clear in our age of materialism and being lied to spiritually, saying that all these healing devices are going to be made with the machines, and you can avoid death with the chips and the brain chips and all this. This is directly going against spiritual laws, going against your nature, and you need to know that. And hopefully through studying death and understanding death is also a metaphor for initiation, we can begin to confront that. Because a lot of stuff today is weirdly about avoiding death. You don't want to avoid death. Okay, you want to live in the rhythm of the planet, the rhythm of the spheres. Okay, that to avoid death is to destroy yourself spiritually. So we have to take that excessive materialist focus and raise it into a spiritual focus. And that's when we're going to start getting traction in society. You know, it's just like in politics right now. You know, we keep trying to bake a cake with the wrong ingredients. We just keep buying different brands of the same ingredients, thinking the cake is going to be better, right? When it's missing the ingredient, it's missing spirit. You're never going to get a better cake unless you have the right ingredients. And right now, there's not enough of a spiritual impulse in anyone to raise the country, to raise the world to where it needs to be. And that's just the reality. So we have to understand what the ingredients are for transformation, what the ingredients are to create change. And there needs to be a certain amount of spiritual force in a person to make change. It's the same thing as being able to pass through the lokas. You have to have a spiritual force that creates a product. There can be no change unless that spiritual force is alive in someone. That force I call Christ. You can call it whatever you want. So let's look at the idea of planetary sojourns in Edgar Cayce's work. So if we were to take all of these weird descriptions and experiences of the soul passing through these lokas, we could kind of zoom out and we could say, okay, well, the soul is in kama-loka. You know, we can see that that's the realm of the moon. And then we could see the soul become more rarefied and expand further into the sphere now of Mercury. It would become even more rarefied and it would expand into the sphere of Venus and then Sun. And so the soul is becoming more and more rarefied and expanding and changing through technically the planetary sphere. So every planetary sphere represents really a different aspect of the spiritual world, of the death process, a different aspect of spiritual human development as well. So I'm going to read you something again from the book by Edgar Cayce called Planetary Influences and Sojourns. Now, he didn't write this book. It's compiled based on his readings. His organization has compiled this book. And so he says in reading 3:11:2, as the entity passes on from this present or this solar system, this sun, these forces, it passes through various spheres. In entering it, the entity takes on those forms that may be known in the dimensions of the plane it occupies. So it's changing and taking on the forms of the plane that it occupies. It's being transfigured, right? Or dismembered and put back together. There being not only 3 dimensions as of the Earth, but there may be 7 in Mercury, or 4 in Venus, or 5 as in Jupiter. There may be only 1 as in Mars. There may be many more as in Neptune, or, here we go, Saturn again. They may become even as nil or nullified in Saturn's fires. So that is Edgar Cayce in a reading describing that the soul, we could view it as having a journey through the gates of heaven, through the gates of each planetary sphere as well. Now, anthroposophy also does a very good job describing this. And so I'm just going to read to you now what Rudolf Steiner said about the death process in the planetary spheres. So basically, when you pass through kama-loka, which is the moon realm, which is, again, it's in between the realm of the moon and the earth. It's not the moon, it's not the earth, it's actually a realm that is in between. The physical moon and earth are just material forms, right? This is a realm. It's also associated with the eighth sphere, which is a different teaching. You know, that's a different mystery. So after you get through the moon realm or the kama-loka, you're passing into, obviously, Venus, Mercury, and Sun. And that process is really a kind of release and reorientation. So it's kind of like the removing of robes or the removing and refining of sheaths, right? It's kind of like a purification or realignment. And then once you pass through the sun, that's the ultimate shift. And then you go through Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and you prepare for a new birth, which is really kind of more like adding on robes or adding on sheaths, adding on what you need for life. The reason why Neptune and Uranus and Pluto are not included is because those are not the classical planets. They have a different purpose. They didn't come about from the same process that the other planets did. They came about for a different purpose, but we coexist with them. That's why they're not included in the traditional, I would say, progression of worlds. So if you want to know a little bit more about the life and rebirth process, Rudolf Steiner has several lectures that go into detail. I'm going to list them in the description below. I have I think 10 different books and lectures that I highly recommend for wanting to go into. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, so I'm making a reading list at the bottom of this that you can check out, especially if you're watching this later. So this is from GA 140, and it's called Life Between Death and Rebirth. And this is where Rudolf Steiner gets into the cosmic element of this and the reality that the soul really, you could see it as moving through and being transfigured in the different planetary spheres. So he says, between death and new birth, man is in a certain connection with the other planets. You will find described in my book, Theosophy, the kama-loka. This sojourn of man in the world of the soul is a time during which man becomes a lunar dweller. He's a lunar dweller in kama-loka. Then he becomes a Mercury dweller, then a Venus dweller, then a Sun dweller. I usually get Mercury and Venus sometimes mixed up, so because they're actually the opposite in the occult. So I'm sorry if I've done that during this lecture. A Mars dweller. Let me read that again. So after kama-loka, where he's a lunar dweller, then he becomes a Mercury dweller, then a Venus dweller, then a Sun dweller, a Mars dweller, a Jupiter dweller, and a Saturn dweller, and then a dweller in the wider space of the heavens of the world. It is not wrong to say that between two incarnations on Earth, there are embodiments on other planets, spiritual embodiments. Let me read that one more time, because there's all this stuff about being a starseed and aliens and these beings from different worlds, and it's all being flattened into one material ideology, and that's really not precise enough, or it's not whole enough. It's not wrong to say that between two incarnations on Earth, there are embodiments on other planets, spiritual embodiments. So embodiments where the soul is having a life, but it's not physical, it's not taking place in the material plane. But from our soul's perspective, we can perhaps remember it, or we have knowledge of it, but it's not a material life. It is a Venus life, it's a Mercury life, it's a Mars life, and the Mars substrate of the cosmos, which is unique from the Earth, in which a transubstantiation needs to occur to even access, right? So man is not yet so far advanced in his development that he can remember in his own incarnation what he has experienced between death and a new birth. But in the future, this will be possible. So Rudolf Steiner says that eventually humanity will be able to remember their sojourns in these different planetary spheres and remember the death process and rebirth process. So humanity is, the idea is if humanity stays on the proper development track and doesn't fall into transhumanism and genetic modification and the destruction of the physical form through control, that we can actually transcend the material world, and more and more and more, by integrating it and actually being a caretaker for it, we can begin to get these abilities back, these memories of other spheres, life on other spheres, which some people can already do, right? He goes on to say, beings of our planetary system are continually streaming past each other. What a vision, beings of our planetary system. So beings from like other worlds are walking amongst us right now as spirits. Beings of our planetary system are continually streaming past each other while we are living on Earth, often imagining that we are surrounded only by beings of the different kingdoms of nature. There are iterants from all the other planets in our environment. During a certain period between death and a new birth, we too are itinerants among the other planetary men. If one might speak in this way, we have to develop in our lives on Earth the essentials of our particular mission in the present epoch of cosmic existence. Other beings are allotted to the planetary worlds, and between death and rebirth, we must contact these worlds too. So we actually come in contact as spirits with these other worlds. Therefore, when reference is made to one region or another of life in Devachan or heaven, it is actually the case, although it's not expressly stated, that the happenings are taking place in some sphere of our planetary system. This should be borne in mind. So this actually makes sense because Rudolf Steiner says, and he's looking obviously into the future, and he's, turn of the century mystic, really, and he's saying people are going to start to remember experiences on other spheres after they've passed from this one. They're going to start to remember them. And that's indeed what I do feel like is happening. Look at this idea of people, saying that they're a starseed, that their soul came from another planet. Yet everybody's soul has passed through the planetary spheres upon death. This is a deep, deep teaching in mystery traditions. Loka, L-O-K-A, means planet. In the Eastern tradition, we see the planets being associated with the lokas, just like Rudolf Steiner is saying, right? You can see the same thing in every tradition. So what's happening is people are beginning to remember this, but they're remembering it in a literalist, materialist way. And spiritual beings are being confused as aliens, or we're starting to try to access this level of cosmic consciousness, but we're doing it in a literalist way. And that is actually one of the great dangers that we have to face. And also why in anthroposophy, the idea is that we have to understand the period of time between death and rebirth. We have to understand the cosmos, that is to say, and the soul's journey in the cosmos, right? Because the trend is to avoid death and to believe in aliens, though that's just not understanding the death process, right? So we have to see what the spiritual root of that is. All right, probably about 5 more minutes here, and then we're going to take it to the other side. So the soul passes through the moon realm, or kama-loka, upon its immediate death. Here it begins to transition into a spiritual being. So the soul begins to become more spiritual once it enters kama-loka. This transition can be seen objectively as the soul expanding into the cosmos sphere by sphere, beginning with the passage through the spheres Mercury, Venus, and Sun. After those sojourns or spiritual lives, the soul begins to prepare for earthly life again by passing through Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So there's kind of a spiritualizing spheres, of, Mercury, Sun, and Venus. And then there's the materializing spheres of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, in which we re-robe for life. So we kind of disrobe and purify as we move closer to the sun from the inner spheres, and then we burst through the sun and we begin to re-robe and retake on certain qualities for life on Earth through the male planets of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. All right. After Saturn, the planet of reamalgamation, the human soul passes into a new earthly life. Now, obviously, Saturn is a raw force, and so some people are not going to pass through Saturn and, be pulled into the second death or whatever. Obviously, some people can pass through Saturn and retain themselves, right? So the planets are not experienced in the same way. So I just wanted to mention that the idea also of, once you pass through the kama-loka realm, you sort of start to enter what are called the heavenly planes that are associated with the spheres. And in anthroposophy, that's called Devachan. In the Eastern traditions, these are basically different lokas. Again, it's Loka, which really means different planets or different worlds. And then in Christianity, the closest thing is heaven. And even within Christianity, there's different, lokas, which are different realms of heaven. There's a second heaven, third heaven, you're getting onto these different, that's the same structure as the other traditions as well. This, in the sense that there's different regions of the spiritual world. That's what I mean. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on a little bit of insight as to when the soul finally does go through all of the trials and dismemberment and sowing and harvesting of sort of the lower worlds as it passes higher and higher. It eventually does reach the more rarefied plane of Devachan, or what would be heaven or the real spiritual world. And so essentially, once souls get to that point, they're obviously at different levels of development, and they have completely different heavenly lives because of the different sort of forces that they've either grounded and forged into their soul through their life in the lower worlds. So not everybody enters Devachan in the same consciousness in the same way, or enters heaven with the same capacities, which is the point of reincarnation, is you hope to descend back into the material world and address all of your faults and try again and become better so that you can build your resurrection body and really have this eternal existence in Devachan or in heaven. And that's also, well, I'll lecture a little bit more on this later. I don't want to get tangential. So when you do make it into the higher spiritual planes, you have a life. Like, you still have associations with people, you have spiritual tasks, you have an opportunity to heal yourself, you have the opportunity to heal relationships that were not in a good condition on Earth. There's opportunities in the heavenly world to work on these relationships. So a lot of people think that, like, oh my gosh, there's this horrible person that has been awful, abusive, truly dark, and they're just going to keep reincarnating and get darker and darker and darker because that dark charge is so strong in them. When the reality is once they pass through the lower, the kama-loka and those more trying initiations of death, they could change, they could awaken. And then when they pass through the higher planes, they come in contact, obviously, with a lot of spiritual angels and beings, and they can work upon themselves if they so choose. So this is where you see that progress, where when you enter spiritual life into the higher worlds or in heaven, you're able to heal and kind of remediate the things that you didn't understand in your life. And so there's, I don't want to say like counseling, I don't want to make it too human and mundane, but there are certain processes that you go through to heal, basically, and then you come around and do it again. So yeah, the soul basically prepares for its next incarnation until it no longer has to take a physical life. So the earth really is the realm in which we experience materiality, we experience the deep polarity and duality, and we experience just the most distance from God. But it also allows us to really forge our eternal self, which survives all trials. All right, that's the goal. That's the goal. All right, so that's pretty much it, you guys. That is the mystery of death. Thank you so very much for joining me. Check back here in a few days or so. It does sometimes take me a little bit to do the timestamps and whatever, but also check back for a reading list. I have a bunch of material that I would recommend if you want to go deeper into this, and I will put that in the description below. And so I am now going to disappear from YouTube and Rumble and Facebook, and I'm going to reappear on my private platform where I will be, where I will be taking your questions. And yeah, I will see you then. And don't forget also to comment, like, and subscribe. For those of you who don't know, I also will be live every second Sunday on my private platform with a great community of mystics and seekers. And I usually go for, usually around 3 hours or so, and I just take your questions. That's all we do. And then I'm usually here on YouTube every other week, or Rumble every other week. And I do also recommend signing up for my newsletter so you don't miss a lecture and you know what's coming out. Also, from the time of now to my next lecture, I will be posting some content that's going to be accompanying this on my social media and also on my blog on my website. So also do check there for just going a little bit deeper into some of these topics. So you guys, thank you so much for joining me today. And for those who are going to be there with me for the question and answer session, I will see you on the other side. And for those that I won't, I will see you very soon right back here.